Welcome again, Vivienne Dick. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. We just screened your film, GUERILLÈRE TALKS, as part of our historical section, which we called All Good Girls Go to Hell. And it was part of a short film program in this section, which we called She-Punk Shorts, in reference to Vivienne Goldman's book, who wrote a feminist music history. And for us, it was really clear that we have to show your film as part of this program as an early gaze into the feminist punk scene in New York and in the 70s, and also maybe as a connection to the so-called no-wave cinema and music, also which kind of influenced generations to come. Yeah, it is maybe we can start by looking back on this time and how you came to make this film in the almost 45 years ago now. It was shortly after you moved to New York. Maybe how do you look back on this time and on the making of this film?
Well, yeah, it was the first film I made, and I was living in New York in the Lower East Side. I'd been there a few years. I'd been in New York a few years, and I was living uptown, and then gravitated downtown because it seemed like more interesting place to be, and also the rents were lower, and there were a number of reasons to be there. And also because I found CBGBs and the music scene there, and was very attracted to the music. And through going there, I eventually, the same sort of people would come all the time, and eventually would get to know the bands, would get to know the musicians, etc., etc. And it just seemed, I just felt like I had arrived in a new world. You know what I mean? I'm from Ireland, and had been to university in Dublin and stuff like that, but I felt very much exhilarated by the scene I found myself in. And it wasn't just the music either. There were so many other things happening at the time in terms of contemporary dance, which I was interested in. I was interested in theatre. I was interested in other kinds of music as well, apart from punk. There was very great jazz playing there still, and Village Vanguard and other places, and this was developing throughout the years I was there, kept changing. New people kept coming in from other parts of America and other places, and the scene kept developing and changing. So it was only for a very short time, really a few years, at least as far as I was concerned, because I left in 82. But anyway, and to get back to the film, GUERILLÈRE TALKS, I got to know some people who were playing in some punk bands. For example, Lydia Lunch was in a band called Teenage Jesus and the Jerks, and Adele Bertai and Pat Place were playing in the early days of Contortions. Eventually, Pat Place formed another band with Cynthia Slay and Depop and Laura Kennedy, and that was called the Bush Tetras. But at that time, when we made that film, they hadn't started to do that yet. And I don't know exactly. I mean, I was interested in photography. I found myself walking by Millennium Film Workshop, which was on 4th Street, not very far from where I lived. And it was in the basement, and I ended up joining the workshop so I could have access to Super 8 cameras. And of course, Super 8 cameras, people aren't using them now anymore, but they were really fantastic at the time. And the quality of the image was so much better than video. Video was very heavy to carry, and it was black and white, and wasn't nearly as practical. Like, what was great about Super 8 as well, I mean, video had this too, but it was much heavier, like I said, porta-packs and things like that. The Super 8 cameras were very compact, and you could fold them up and carry them in your bag, and well, that's what we did. I I suppose, like, I did shoot some film. I was shooting some rolls of film before I made that film, but some of it I made in Ireland. My mother was unwell, was dying, in fact, and I came home and filmed some footage with her. But in New York, when I started to do that, I suppose unconsciously, because I wasn't quite thinking of Warhol screen tests or anything like that, but that's, you know, I was fascinated by the people I was filming, in the sense that I suppose I saw them as a new kind of women, because it was all women that I filmed, and I hadn't the intention to make a film out of it. I was just shooting a roll of film, one roll of films, and that was like just over 3 minutes long. So I would invite somebody to present themselves, and they could choose a location. And we had the sound that was just plugged into the camera, really, really simple. I didn't even have a sound person. And they could speak or not speak as they chose. So that's really how it got started. And that was the first time I met Lydia, was when I shot that piece of film with her. So other people then, there's Beata Nilsson was there. She was a friend of mine, a photographer living in New York at the time. And there was Adele Bertai, who's a musician. There was Ikawe Mori, who's Japanese, living in New York, and was the drummer in DNA, in the band DNA. So it's a series of women there. There was Anya Phillips as well, who was on the scene, and a close friend of James Chance, and also sings some of his recordings. So I was only afterwards, when I'd shot the film, that I made the decision to splice them all together and make one piece. And the title comes from Monique Wittig's book Les Guerrières, which we had a small group. We used to hang out on the roof of my building, and we would be discussing, I suppose we would be discussing what it meant to be a woman in the world today, which is extremely patriarchal then as it is now. But that's what, you know, we were discussing, how to survive in New York, things like that. And we had a plan to make a film together. We were talking about these things. So the title of the film comes from Monique Wittig's book, basically, which we'd been reading and discussing.
Yeah, that's a lot of interesting aspects I also wanted to talk about, maybe before also talking about over the reception of the film. I would be interested in this, really, like you said, these encounters you see in the film. For me, it's really great and really intimate, kind of, to get close to these people. For me, it's also, you not only see musicians and hear music in your films, but for me also the films are kind of like an extension of some musical approaches of that time for me. I had to think about the terms of like directness and distortion, which I kind of find in your films, because, like I said, you get really close to the characters, to the protagonists, but also there's also this DIY spirit you talked about with the super DIY spirit you talked about with the Super 8 camera. But it also creates in moments like a little bit of a distortion, like, for example, with the camera movements, or when the light comes in, and of course there's no real narrative or explanation, which kind of also for me reflects kind of music, the music of that time. So your films have a musical or rhythmical approach also for me. Can you maybe talk about this approach, or can you relate to this?
Yeah, well, music and rhythm, I mean, for me, editing is all about that. It's all about the timing, and that was the case then and still is now. It's really important that. Also very influenced by music. I mean, it might say sometimes a starting point, an idea for a film could come out of a piece of music, or could come out of a location, and location is also important to me. I mean, I suppose the making of my work, especially, well, the first film, Les Guerrières, was very people talking to camera, so it's very straightforward. And films I made after that had a different form, a slightly different shape, like perhaps mixing narrative with, there's always a documentary feel there. There's always a feeling of this is just real life. And sometimes the distinction between something that's like meant to be fiction or something that's documentary is not clear. It kind of swings back and forth, and I quite like that, actually. I'm interested in that. I'm also interested in performance. So I'd say those three elements are there. Often in my work, I'm interested in performance to camera, which you have in Guerriere Talks, of course. There's also documentary elements in Guerriere Talks too. And then in other films I made after that, Beauty Becomes the Beast, Liberty's Booty, there are elements of fiction that kind of interweave. So, I mean, it is kind of intuitive, and it's kind of like, for me, I didn't see myself as a filmmaker when I was making those. I was just making something the way everybody else was making something, in the sense that I don't think people were really focused on success, like commercial success. Certainly not working with Super 8, we weren't thinking that way, but it was very alive. Luckily, I was living in a community where there was kind of, because it's like making a film is like a conversation. You put it out there, you project it, and you have an audience, and so there's a feedback from the audience, and that's very exciting, because you can feel, you can tell when something is being understood, or is having an effect, or is is working. So yeah, it was my first time to do something like that. It was very exciting. I always projected my own films, because Super 8 is so fragile, and I had no copies. I just had the original film spliced together. So I would always inspect and clean the projector before using it. And I'm so glad I did that, because I've been able to, now you can do really good digital transfers, but yeah, I always kind of looked, I always, it's hard to know why, but I believed in the work, even then. I was, yeah, whatever. I just, so.
But yeah, it's interesting, because I actually wanted to ask also in that direction, like how the films were perceived in the time they were made, like how were they screened back then? How did they find their audiences, and at which places were they screened?
Well, the thing is, it's all connected to the music scene. I mean, what happened was, I met a few other people like Beth B. Just one evening, in fact, I met them. I met James Nares, Beth B., Eric Mitchell, Tina Lahotsky. She was a filmmaker at the time as well. And we were all interested. We had that in common. We were in this scene. We were hanging out in this scene, going to hear these musicians play, hanging out in the same clubs. And we were interested in making somewhat narrative films. Maybe the other filmmakers were more interested in a different kind of more narrative films than I was. But we decided that we should show them in the clubs between the bands. So you'd have a band play, then we'd have film projection, then the band again. So we did that in quite a few places. Like I suppose an early club would have been a place called Tier 3 and the Mud Club, and say Max's Kansas City, which had been going a long time before the punk scene was a popular place in the 60s. Yeah.
And do you have the feeling that the reception of your films, like over the years, maybe there was a switch and it changed, and now they are screened maybe, for example, at film festivals, or maybe in a context of museums or something?
Yeah, that's true. That did happen. Now, at the time, there was an amazing response. I mean, we really surprised that film critics that were really well known for the papers, like the papers which everyone read, like the Village Voice and the Soho Weekly News. They were the key newspapers you could buy to see what was happening and whatever. And so we had some reviews of our work in these newspapers. And as a result of that, I was getting phone calls from art venues, experimental film venues from around the country. So I spent a year and a half going to these places this was when I made a few more films, of course. And this was a really amazing opportunity for me, and really interesting as well, because I hadn't realized that this independent circuit was there, had been there from way back, from, say, Maya Deren's day. She was the one who started showing at film clubs, or setting up film clubs to screen experimental work. This has been going, and many of these places were in universities, colleges, and some not, depends. But I did quite a bit of traveling for a while there, And then, like you said, after that, and I moved back to Ireland and moved to live in England. And well, first of all, when I came to Ireland, I mean, people, when I showed the films locally, people understood them, people liked them, or at least there was a response to them. But in terms of getting funding, they could not understand what I was doing. And they kept asking me, where's the script? I don't use scripts. So it wasn't easy. But when I moved to England, I was supported immediately by the British Arts Council, which was fantastic. Now, I get a lot of support here now, but that was back in the day, in the early 80s. But it's true, there was a period, I joined the Filmmakers Co-op and I was very interested in what everyone was doing there. I was that was my tribe kind of thing. But like, you know, those films that I made in New York were more or less, they weren't shown very much. They were sitting there for quite a few years. And I was thinking of making new films. And, you know, it just felt like something in the past. But then bit by bit, people started wanting to see them. And that, I suppose, the first big screening was in the Filmmakers Co-op. Somebody wanted to see a program of those films. And then it just kind of went from there bit by bit, you know, and it's true, there is a great interest in that period, you see. I mean, in a way, my work's connected to this no wave music thing, you know, and it wasn't just music either. There was so many interesting other things in the arts, in the visual arts, etc., that was happening at that time. So, and it's been recently very much become an academic subject for universities, for whatever, books written, films made, etc. So there is an interest there, you know, and it's just one of these things, like things come into the fore and then they kind of, you know, I'm just interested in continuing to make films. I'm not stuck in there in that period at all. But it's nice to get them out there and to get them shown, for sure.
Yeah.
Because they're not commercial films, so they'll never have that kind of distribution. Although I do, my work is distributed by Lux in the UK.
Yeah, I think it's also maybe also with the emergence of more feminist and queer film theory, it's also the focus shifts also to this time, because it was quite a, you know, it has quite its roots kind of in that time also, partly. So maybe also, do you see like the films being rediscovered today and also more being talked about, like over film history in this feminist and queer sense? Do you see yourself as a kind of pioneer in that sense, or do you see yourself connected to this development? Or?
Well, I would be very happy yeah, I'm very happy to be part of a kind of a line of women who have the desire to express themselves with film, for sure, because I suppose I grew up puzzled by how few, and still am, how few filmmakers there are out there who are women. And also the subject matter is always concerning, you know, stories that perhaps men might be more interested in. Women were always peripheral in the films that I grew up with, you know, more or less, you know, or there would be certain stereotypes, certain parts, and any woman that had a strong part was often the one that got killed, you know, in the film noir, for example. So, I mean, definitely there was a decision on my part from the beginning to focus more on women than men, because I felt that women had needed a voice and needed an opportunity to make themselves heard, yeah, to tell their stories, yeah. But then I'm not really a storytelling. I mean, I do tell stories, but they're very much interwoven with other things. I'm interested in, you know, something very basic, like what am I in this world today, and what is this world about? What's happening? You know, things about philosophy, things about what kind of world do we want to live in? I'm interested in those kind of questions. So they're kind of big questions, but I'm always trying to figure out ways to work this, you know, to express this in films that people will be able to respond to. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that works really well, and I hope also we can contribute a little bit to this questions with our screenings at our festival. Yeah, so thanks again so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Not at all. Thanks for asking me and for inviting me to the festival.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, we were really happy to have you. Yeah. All right.
Okay.